Marcus had always been a man of desperate attachments. He clutched outcomes like a drowning sailor grips driftwood, believing that his survival depended entirely on the success or failure of each individual wave. For 37 years, he had lived this way, consumed by the need to control results, devastated by unexpected turns, and perpetually anxious about futures he could not guarantee. His business ventures had been emotional roller coasters, his relationships battlegrounds of expectation, and his career a series of frantic scrambles toward outcomes that seemed to slip through his fingers the tighter he held them. It was during the collapse of his third startup that Marcus encountered Victor, an enigmatic consultant who seemed to navigate crisis with the calm of a chessmaster contemplating his next move. While Marcus paced the conference room, calculating losses and imagining worst-case scenarios, Victor sat quietly, observing the chaos with detached curiosity. When the final investor meeting ended in disaster, Marcus expected commiseration. Instead, Victor smiled. "You've been playing the game wrong," Victor said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen similar scenes countless times before. "You're attached to outcomes you cannot control, while neglecting the only thing you can truly master, your method." This conversation became the catalyst for Marcus's transformation from a reactive victim of circumstance to a strategic architect of his own destiny. The principles Victor shared that day formed the foundation of what would later become Marcus's philosophy of strategic detachment, a Machiavellian approach to life that emphasized control over process rather than results, belief in systematic thinking rather than emotional reactions, and the cultivation of internal strength through the deliberate destruction of weakness. The concept of releasing outcomes while maintaining unwavering belief in method represents a fundamental shift in how we approach challenge and opportunity. Traditional thinking suggests that caring deeply about results is the key to achievement. The Machiavellian mindset recognizes this as a strategic error. When we attach our emotional well-being to specific outcomes, we become slaves to forces beyond our control. Market conditions shift, people change their minds, unexpected events disrupt our plans. The person who has invested their entire sense of self-worth in a particular result becomes vulnerable to destruction by external forces. Marcus learned this lesson through painful experience. His first startup had failed because he became so fixated on a specific vision of success that he ignored market feedback suggesting a different direction. His second venture collapsed when a key partnership fell through, leaving him emotionally devastated and unable to pivot effectively. Each failure taught him that emotional investment in outcomes, while natural, was strategically counterproductive. The alternative approach, releasing outcomes while maintaining absolute faith in method, requires a fundamental rewiring of our relationship with control. We cannot control whether other people will respond to our proposals the way we hope. We cannot control market conditions, economic downturns, or the decisions of competitors. We cannot control the timing of opportunities or the personal circumstances that might affect our ability to pursue them. What we can control is our approach, our preparation, our response to feedback, and our ability to adapt when circumstances change. Victor taught Marcus to think of outcomes as information rather than verdicts. A rejected proposal is not a personal failure. It is data about market conditions, timing, or the effectiveness of our presentation. A lost opportunity is not evidence of inadequacy, it is feedback about our positioning or preparation. When we view results as information rather than judgments, we maintain the emotional equilibrium necessary for strategic thinking. This shift requires developing what Marcus came to call outcome immunity, the ability to maintain psychological stability regardless of short-term results. Outcome immunity does not mean indifference to results. Rather, it means understanding that our value as strategists, our long-term trajectory, and our ultimate success depend on the quality of our thinking and the consistency of our execution rather than any single outcome. The development of outcome immunity begins with recognizing the difference between process goals and outcome goals. Process goals focus on behaviors we can directly control, making a certain number of calls, conducting thorough research, preparing comprehensive proposals, maintaining consistent communication with key contacts. Outcome goals focus on results that depend partly on factors beyond our control, closing a specific deal, getting a particular job, achieving a certain level of revenue by a specific date. Marcus discovered that when he shifted his focus from outcome goals to process goals, his performance actually improved. Instead of obsessing over whether a potential client would sign a contract, he focused on conducting the most thorough needs analysis possible, crafting the most compelling presentation he could create, and following up with precise timing and relevant value additions. Paradoxically, this detachment from outcomes led to better outcomes because it allowed him to think more clearly, respond more flexibly to feedback, and maintain the confidence necessary for persuasive communication. The Machiavellian approach to outcome detachment is not passive acceptance or fatalistic resignation. It is active engagement with the only aspects of any situation we can truly control. Machiavelli understood that princes who became emotionally attached to specific political outcomes often made strategic errors that led to their downfall. The prince who could maintain psychological distance from any particular result while remaining absolutely committed to effective governance was more likely to survive and thrive in the complex world of political competition. This principle applies equally to modern professional and personal challenges. The entrepreneur who releases attachment to a specific vision while remaining committed to solving customer problems can pivot when market feedback suggests a different direction. The executive who detaches from a particular career path while maintaining commitment to excellent performance can recognize and pursue unexpected opportunities. The negotiator who releases attachment to specific terms while remaining focused on creating mutual value can find creative solutions that satisfy all parties. Marcus's transformation accelerated when he began practicing what Victor called strategic emotional regulation. This involved developing the ability to experience emotions fully while preventing them from driving strategic decisions. Fear about potential failure could be acknowledged and processed without allowing it to paralyze decision-making. Excitement about potential success could be enjoyed without leading to overconfidence or poor planning. The practice of strategic emotional regulation requires developing metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe our own thinking processes. When Marcus felt anxiety about an upcoming presentation, he learned to recognize the anxiety, understand its source, and then redirect his attention to preparation activities that would actually improve his performance. When he felt excitement about a potential opportunity, he learned to channel that energy into thorough analysis and careful planning rather than premature celebration or overcommitment. This emotional regulation is crucial because attachment to outcomes often leads to emotional volatility that impairs judgment. The person who is desperate for a particular result may compromise their standards, make premature concessions, or communicate from a position of weakness. The person who is emotionally detached from specific outcomes can maintain the psychological strength necessary for effective negotiation, strategic thinking, and confident communication. Victor emphasized that outcome detachment is not about suppressing ambition or lowering standards. It is about redirecting ambition toward factors we can actually control. Instead of being ambitious about specific results, we become ambitious about the quality of our analysis, the thoroughness of our preparation, and the consistency of our execution. This shift in focus often leads to better results because it concentrates our energy on activities that actually influence outcomes. The principle of releasing outcomes while believing in method extends beyond individual projects to encompass our overall approach to life and career. Many people oscillate between periods of intense effort driven by specific goals and periods of disengagement when those goals become challenging or delayed. The Machiavellian mindset maintains consistent engagement with our strategic development regardless of short-term results. Marcus began to understand that his previous pattern of boom and bust effort was strategically inefficient. When things were going well, he would reduce his focus on fundamental skill development, relationship building, and market analysis, assuming that current success indicated future security. When things went poorly, he would become so emotionally disrupted that he could not think clearly about necessary adjustments or new opportunities. The alternative approach involves maintaining consistent investment in what Victor called strategic fundamentals regardless of current circumstances. These fundamentals include continuous learning about our field, systematic relationship building with key contacts, regular analysis of market trends and opportunities, and ongoing development of core skills that transcend any particular role or project. Strategic fundamentals are process-oriented activities that create long-term advantage. Unlike outcome-oriented goals, they do not depend on external validation or specific results for their value. The knowledge gained from reading industry publications has value whether or not it immediately leads to a specific opportunity. The relationships built through consistent networking create options whether or not they immediately generate referrals. The skills developed through deliberate practice increase our capabilities whether or not they immediately improve our performance in current roles. Marcus's commitment to strategic fundamentals created a foundation of confidence that was not dependent on any particular situation. When his fourth startup faced unexpected challenges, he was able to respond strategically rather than emotionally because his underlying capabilities and network had continued developing regardless of the company's specific trajectory. This internal strength, built through consistent investment in process-oriented development, made him anti-fragile, stronger in the face of adversity rather than weakened by it. The concept of anti-fragility, developed by Nassim Taleb, describes systems that actually benefit from stress and volatility. In the context of personal development, anti-fragility means building capabilities and mindsets that become stronger when challenged. The person who has cultivated outcome detachment and process focus becomes anti-fragile because setbacks provide information for strategic adjustment rather than emotional devastation. Victor explained that most people are fragile in their relationship with outcomes. They break under pressure, become demoralized by setbacks, and lose confidence when results do not meet expectations. Some people are robust, they can withstand pressure and setbacks without significant damage, but they do not necessarily grow stronger from challenges. The Machiavellian practitioner aims for anti-fragility, the ability to become stronger, wiser, and more capable through exposure to difficulty and uncertainty. Anti-fragility requires developing what Marcus called strategic skepticism about our own initial plans and assumptions. Instead of viewing plan changes as failures, we view them as evidence that we are responsive to new information. Instead of viewing setbacks as indicators of inadequacy, we view them as opportunities to develop resilience and problem-solving capabilities. Instead of viewing uncertainty as a threat, we view it as a source of competitive advantage for those who can navigate it effectively. This perspective shift transforms our relationship with challenge and uncertainty. The entrepreneur who has cultivated anti-fragility views market volatility as an opportunity to test and improve their business model. The professional who has developed strategic skepticism views career setbacks as chances to discover new strengths or pursue previously unconsidered directions. The negotiator who has embraced uncertainty views difficult conversations as opportunities to develop more sophisticated influence skills. Marcus's journey toward outcome detachment was not immediate or easy. Years of conditioning had trained him to measure his worth by external results. Learning to find satisfaction in process excellence and strategic development required conscious practice and frequent course correction. Victor provided a framework for this development that Marcus found invaluable. The framework began with daily reflection practices designed to strengthen the distinction between process and outcome. Each evening, Marcus would review the day's activities, identifying what had been within his control and what had been beyond it. He would evaluate his performance on process-oriented criteria. Had he prepared thoroughly? Had he communicated clearly? Had he responded to feedback appropriately? Had he maintained emotional equilibrium under pressure? This reflection practice gradually shifted his internal reward system. Instead of feeling good or bad based on external results, he began to feel satisfaction from executing his process effectively, even when outcomes were disappointing. This internal validation system made him less dependent on external approval and more resilient in the face of setbacks. The second component of Victor's framework involved systematic exposure to uncertainty and potential failure. Many people avoid situations where outcomes are unclear because they have not developed the emotional regulation skills necessary to handle ambiguity. Marcus began deliberately seeking opportunities that involved significant uncertainty, speaking at conferences where he could not predict audience reaction, proposing partnerships where acceptance was far from guaranteed, pursuing projects where success depended on factors beyond his control. Each exposure to uncertainty was treated as practice for emotional regulation and strategic thinking under pressure. Marcus learned to maintain clear thinking when outcomes were unclear, to find creative solutions when standard approaches were insufficient, and to communicate confidently when he could not guarantee specific results. These capabilities proved invaluable in high-stakes situations where others were paralyzed by uncertainty. The third component involved building what Victor called strategic redundancy in multiple areas of life. Instead of depending on any single source of income, relationship, or identity, Marcus developed multiple options that could provide security and satisfaction. This redundancy made any single outcome less critical to his overall well-being, which in turn made him more effective in pursuing each individual opportunity. Strategic redundancy does not mean scattered effort or lack of focus. It means building capabilities and relationships that create multiple paths toward our objectives. The consultant who has developed expertise in multiple industries is less vulnerable to downturns in any single sector. The executive who has built relationships across multiple departments and companies has more options when organizational changes occur. The entrepreneur who has developed multiple revenue streams is less dependent on any single customer or market segment. Marcus discovered that strategic redundancy actually improved his performance in each individual area because it reduced the desperation that often leads to poor decisions. When he knew that his financial security did not depend entirely on any single client relationship, he could negotiate more effectively because he was genuinely prepared to walk away from unfavorable terms. When he had developed multiple potential career paths, he could pursue opportunities based on strategic fit rather than fear of missing out. The cultivation of strategic redundancy requires long-term thinking and consistent investment in relationship building, skill development, and opportunity creation. It cannot be achieved quickly when crisis strikes. Like physical fitness, strategic redundancy must be built systematically over time through consistent effort and maintained through ongoing investment. Victor's fourth component focused on developing what he called strategic patience, the ability to maintain long-term perspective when short-term results are disappointing. Strategic patience does not mean passive waiting or acceptance of poor performance. It means maintaining confidence in our methodology and continuing to execute effectively even when immediate feedback is negative or unclear. Strategic patience requires understanding the difference between leading and lagging indicators. Leading indicators are activities and metrics that predict future results, the number of quality relationships being built, the depth of skill development occurring, the sophistication of analysis being conducted. Lagging indicators are the results that follow from sustained execution of leading indicator activities, revenue growth, career advancement, competitive victories. Most people focus primarily on lagging indicators and become emotionally reactive when these results do not meet expectations or do not arrive according to preferred timelines. The strategically patient person focuses on leading indicators while monitoring lagging indicators for strategic information. They understand that sustained excellence in leading indicator activities will eventually produce desired lagging indicator results, but that the timing and specific form of those results cannot be precisely controlled. Marcus learned to derive satisfaction from improvements in leading indicators even when lagging indicator results were delayed. When his networking efforts had not yet generated specific opportunities, he found satisfaction in the growing quality of his professional relationships. When his skill development had not yet translated to career advancement, he took confidence in his increasing capabilities. This focus on leading indicators maintained his motivation and strategic focus during periods when external results were disappointing. The development of strategic patience also requires understanding the compound nature of most significant achievements. Just as compound financial returns accelerate over time, the benefits of consistent execution of strategic fundamentals tend to accumulate and multiply. The relationships built through systematic networking eventually create a web of mutual support and opportunity creation. The skills developed through deliberate practice eventually reach levels that create unique competitive advantages. The reputation built through consistent excellent performance eventually generates opportunities that would be unavailable to those without established track records. Understanding the compound nature of strategic development helps maintain motivation during periods when immediate results are minimal. The person who has been building relationships for 6 months may see little immediate benefit, but the person who has been building relationships for 6 years typically has access to opportunities and resources that would be impossible to obtain quickly. The professional who has been developing specialized expertise for 2 years may not yet be recognized as an expert, but the professional who has been developing expertise for 10 years typically has capabilities that create significant competitive advantages. Victor's framework culminated in what he called outcome optimization through outcome detachment. This apparent paradox reflects the reality that excessive attachment to specific results often impairs the clear thinking and flexible execution necessary to achieve those results. The salesperson who is desperate to close a particular deal may push too hard and create resistance. The job candidate who is overly attached to a specific position may interview poorly due to anxiety or may fail to recognize that the role is not actually a good fit. Conversely, the person who has developed genuine detachment from specific outcomes while maintaining absolute commitment to effective process often achieves better results because they can think more clearly, respond more flexibly to feedback, and communicate from a position of strength rather than neediness. This is not about caring less, it is about caring more effectively by focusing our concern on factors we can actually control. Marcus's transformation through the principles of outcome detachment, method belief, and strategic development created a foundation for the second aspect of his journey, learning to control the game itself rather than merely reacting to circumstances created by others. The internal strength developed through outcome detachment became the basis for external influence and strategic positioning that would define the next phase of his development. Part 2, The Architecture of Control in Complex Systems. The conference room fell silent as Marcus presented his counteroffer. 3 months earlier, he would have accepted the initial terms out of fear that negotiation might jeopardize the entire deal. Now, having internalized Victor's teachings about strategic detachment, he could see the negotiation as a complex system with multiple variables he could influence. The outcome was less important than his method of engagement, which allowed him to think clearly about leverage, timing, and positioning rather than anxiously calculating the probability of acceptance. This moment marked Marcus's transition from passive reactor to active architect of his circumstances. The mindset shifts he had developed around outcome detachment became the foundation for a more sophisticated understanding of influence and control. Where he had previously seen himself as subject to external forces, market conditions, client decisions, competitive pressures, he now began to recognize the multiple ways he could shape the systems within which he operated. Victor had explained that true control is rarely about dominating specific outcomes through force or manipulation. Instead, it involves understanding the underlying structure of complex systems and positioning oneself to influence those structures in subtle but significant ways. The Machiavellian approach to control recognizes that sustainable influence comes from understanding and working with system dynamics rather than against them. Modern life presents us with numerous complex systems, professional networks, organizational hierarchies, market ecosystems, social dynamics, information flows. Each of these systems operates according to certain patterns and principles that can be understood and influenced by those who invest the effort to study them carefully. The person who understands how influence actually works within these systems can achieve their objectives more efficiently and sustainably than the person who relies on direct force or emotional manipulation. Marcus's education in systemic control began with Victor's analysis of his failed negotiations and missed opportunities. In each case, Marcus had focused on immediate tactical concerns, what to say, how to present his offer, whether to make concessions, without considering the broader strategic context that determined his negotiating position. He had not understood how his reputation, relationships, alternative options, and timing affected his ability to influence outcomes. The first principle of systemic control involves mapping the actual structure of influence within any given system. Most people operate with simplified models of how influence works, assuming that formal authority, logical arguments, or emotional appeals are sufficient to achieve their objectives. The strategic thinker invests time in understanding the actual network of relationships, interests, and decision-making processes that determine outcomes within specific systems. Marcus learned to approach each significant negotiation or opportunity by conducting what Victor called influence archaeology, a systematic investigation of who actually makes decisions, what factors influence those decision-makers, who else has influence over the situation, and how various stakeholders' interests align or conflict. This analysis often revealed opportunities for influence that were not apparent from surface-level interactions. In one memorable case, Marcus was pursuing a consulting contract with a large corporation. His initial approach focused on the formal decision-maker, the head of strategy, presenting logical arguments about his methodology and credentials. When this approach generated polite interest but no commitment, Marcus conducted influence archaeology and discovered that the strategy head's assistant had significant informal influence over his calendar and priorities, that the CFO had veto power over consulting expenditures, and that a previous consultant had created resistance to external advisors through poor performance. This analysis led to a completely different approach. Instead of focusing solely on the strategy head, Marcus began building relationships across the system. He provided valuable insights to the CFO about industry cost benchmarks that helped with budget planning. He treated the assistant as a strategic ally, providing scheduling flexibility and clear communication about project scope. He obtained references from previous clients that specifically addressed the concerns created by the failed consulting relationship. This systemic approach required more time and effort than his previous direct appeal method, but it created multiple paths to success rather than depending on a single point of influence. When the formal decision was finally made, it felt inevitable rather than uncertain because Marcus had built support throughout the system rather than relying on a single relationship. The second principle of systemic control involves understanding and working with incentive structures rather than against them. Every system operates according to certain incentive patterns that reward particular behaviors and discourage others. The strategically minded person studies these incentive structures carefully and aligns their approach with the system's natural tendencies rather than fighting against them. Victor taught Marcus to analyze incentive structures at multiple levels: individual, organizational, and systemic. At the individual level, what does each key stakeholder need to achieve their personal objectives? At the organizational level, what metrics and outcomes drive resource allocation and recognition? At the systemic level, what larger trends and pressures influence how the entire system evolves? Understanding incentive structures allows for much more sophisticated influence strategies. Instead of trying to convince someone to act against their interests, the strategic influencer finds ways to align their objectives with the target's existing incentives. Instead of fighting against organizational priorities, they position their proposals as solutions to problems the organization is already motivated to solve. Marcus applied this principle when seeking a board position with a professional association. His initial approach had focused on his own qualifications and interest in contributing to the organization. When this generated little response, he analyzed the association's incentive structures and discovered that board members were evaluated primarily on their ability to recruit new members and generate revenue-producing events. Marcus repositioned his candidacy around his ability to address these organizational priorities. He proposed specific member recruitment strategies based on his network in underrepresented industry segments. He outlined potential educational events that would generate revenue while providing genuine value to members. He demonstrated understanding of the board's actual priorities rather than simply asserting his desire to serve. This repositioning transformed his candidacy from one of many qualified applications to a strategic solution for problems the organization was actively trying to solve. His eventual appointment to the board felt natural and inevitable rather than competitive because he had aligned his proposal with the system's existing incentives. The third principle involves creating strategic positioning that enhances influence regardless of immediate tactical outcomes. Strategic positioning is about building structural advantages that persist across multiple situations rather than optimizing for any single interaction. This requires long-term thinking and consistent investment in reputation, relationships, and capabilities that create ongoing influence. Victor introduced Marcus to the concept of influence assets, reputation elements, relationships, capabilities, and positions that increase overall influence across multiple contexts. Unlike tactical advantages, which provide benefit in specific situations, influence assets create compound returns by enhancing effectiveness across many different circumstances. Reputation assets include recognition for expertise in valuable areas, track record of reliable performance, and association with successful outcomes. Relationship assets include connections with influential individuals, positions within important networks, and reciprocal support arrangements with strategic allies. Capability assets include skills that others need, access to valuable resources, and ability to create value in situations where others cannot. Position assets include formal roles that provide influence, informal positions that create access to information or decision makers, and strategic locations within networks that allow for information arbitrage or connection facilitation. Marcus began systematically building influence assets rather than simply pursuing immediate opportunities. He invested time in developing specialized expertise that would be valuable across multiple client situations. He built relationships with key influencers in his industry, not for immediate benefit, but to create long-term strategic positioning. He sought roles and assignments that would enhance his reputation and expand his network, even when the immediate compensation was modest. This systematic approach to influence asset building created what Victor called strategic optionality, the ability to respond effectively to unexpected opportunities or challenges because of accumulated advantages that transcend any specific situation. When market conditions shifted unexpectedly in Marcus's industry, he was able to pivot more effectively than competitors because his influence assets provided multiple paths forward. The fourth principle focuses on information advantage as a source of sustainable influence. In complex systems, information asymmetries create opportunities for those who invest in gathering, analyzing, and strategically sharing information that others lack. The person who understands market trends before they become obvious, who recognizes emerging opportunities before they become competitive, or who can synthesize information from multiple sources to create unique insights has significant influence potential. Marcus learned to approach information strategically rather than passively. Instead of consuming information randomly, he developed systematic methods for gathering intelligence about industry trends, competitive dynamics, regulatory changes, and stakeholder priorities. He built relationships with information sources across multiple contexts, creating an early warning system for important developments. More importantly, he learned to analyze information for strategic implications rather than simply staying informed. The same industry report that competitors read for general knowledge became a source of specific opportunity identification and risk mitigation planning. The networking conversations that others approached as social interactions became sources of market intelligence and strategic positioning information. Strategic information sharing became another source of influence. By providing valuable insights to key stakeholders, Marcus positioned himself as a strategic resource rather than simply another service provider. His quarterly industry analysis became something that clients anticipated and shared with their networks, enhancing his reputation and expanding his influence. The fifth principle involves creating systemic dependence through value creation rather than attempting to gain control through manipulation or coercion. Sustainable influence comes from becoming indispensable to important stakeholders by consistently providing value that they cannot easily obtain elsewhere. This approach builds long-term loyalty and influence because it aligns the influencer's success with the stakeholder's success. Victor distinguished between extraction-based and creation-based approaches to influence. Extraction-based approaches focus on getting value from others through persuasion, manipulation, or pressure. These approaches may work in the short term but often create resistance and relationship deterioration over time. Creation-based approaches focus on providing value to others in ways that create mutual benefit and ongoing relationship development. Marcus transformed his consulting practice from an extraction-based model to a creation-based model. Instead of focusing primarily on billable hours and project fees, he began thinking about how his work could create lasting value for clients that would generate ongoing opportunities for collaboration. Instead of optimizing individual projects for immediate profitability, he optimized for client success and long-term relationship development. This shift required developing capabilities that created unique value for clients rather than simply delivering services they could obtain elsewhere. Marcus invested in developing proprietary methodologies, building specialized expertise, and creating analytical frameworks that provided insights unavailable from other sources. This differentiation allowed him to become strategically valuable rather than merely tactically useful. The creation-based approach also extended to his broader professional network. Instead of approaching relationships primarily in terms of what he could gain, Marcus began systematically looking for ways to create value for others. He made strategic introductions that benefited both parties, shared opportunities with colleagues who were better positioned to pursue them, and provided insights and analysis that helped others make better strategic decisions. This value creation approach transformed his network from a collection of transactional relationships into a community of mutual support and opportunity sharing. People began bringing opportunities to Marcus not because he was pushing for them, but because they wanted to work with someone who consistently created value for others. The sixth principle emphasizes timing and sequencing as critical elements of systemic influence. Many influence attempts fail not because of poor strategy or inadequate resources, but because of poor timing. The same approach that fails in one context may succeed dramatically in another context due to timing differences. Strategic influence requires understanding the rhythms and cycles that affect system receptivity to different types of influence. Marcus learned to analyze timing factors at multiple levels. At the individual level, when are key decision makers most receptive to new ideas? At the organizational level, what cycles affect resource allocation and strategic planning? At the market level, what trends create opportunities for particular types of value creation? Understanding timing patterns allowed Marcus to optimize his influence efforts for maximum effectiveness. Instead of pushing proposals when stakeholders were focused on other priorities, he learned to position his initiatives to align with natural decision-making cycles. Instead of making major requests during stressful periods, he waited for moments when stakeholders had the mental bandwidth to consider new opportunities thoughtfully. Sequencing became equally important. Marcus learned to build influence through carefully orchestrated series of interactions rather than single dramatic gestures. Each conversation, proposal, or collaboration was designed to set up more significant opportunities in the future. This systematic approach created momentum and credibility that made larger requests more likely to succeed. The seventh principle involves leveraging network effects to amplify individual influence efforts. In interconnected systems, influence often spreads through network propagation rather than direct communication. The person who understands how networks actually function can achieve broader influence with less direct effort by triggering network effects that amplify their initial inputs. Victor taught Marcus to map the network topology of important systems, identifying key nodes, connection patterns, and information flow dynamics. Some individuals serve as connectors who have relationships across multiple subnetworks. Others serve as influencers whose opinions carry disproportionate weight within their networks. Still others serve as gatekeepers who control access to important resources or decision makers. Understanding network topology allows for much more efficient influence strategies. Instead of trying to reach every stakeholder directly, the strategic networker focuses on the key nodes that can amplify their message throughout the system. Instead of competing for attention with direct appeals, they position their ideas to be shared and advocated by others who have established credibility and relationships. Marcus applied this principle when launching a new service offering. Instead of conducting broad marketing campaigns, he focused on a small number of influential practitioners who were well connected within his target market. He provided these key influencers with early access to his methodology, incorporated their feedback into his approach, and supported their own success in ways that created natural opportunities for them to recommend his services. This network leveraged approach created more credible and effective promotion than any direct marketing effort could have achieved. Recommendations from trusted colleagues carried more weight than self-promotion, and the social proof created by early adopter success made subsequent adoption decisions much easier for other potential clients. The eighth principle focuses on systemic resilience, building influence approaches that become stronger under pressure rather than weaker. Many influence strategies are fragile, they work well under favorable conditions but collapse when systems experience stress or change. Anti-fragile influence strategies actually benefit from volatility and uncertainty because they are designed to adapt and strengthen rather than simply endure. Marcus learned to build redundancy into his influence systems so that no single relationship, opportunity, or approach was critical to his overall success. This redundancy paradoxically made each individual relationship more valuable because it allowed him to engage authentically rather than desperately. People are naturally attracted to those who are confident and selective rather than needy and available to everyone. Systemic resilience also required developing the ability to pivot and adapt when circumstances changed unexpectedly. Instead of becoming committed to specific influence strategies, Marcus learned to focus on influence objectives while maintaining flexibility about methods. When one approach proved ineffective, he could quickly shift to alternative methods without losing momentum or credibility. The development of anti-fragile influence capabilities prepared Marcus for the third and perhaps most important aspect of his transformation, the systematic destruction of internal weaknesses that made him vulnerable to external manipulation and control. The external influence capabilities he had developed would be meaningless if he remained internally weak and reactive. True strategic strength required confronting and eliminating the psychological vulnerabilities that others could exploit. Victor's teachings about systemic influence and strategic positioning created the foundation for understanding how strong individuals could shape their environments rather than merely adapting to them. However, this external capability would prove sustainable only if supported by equally sophisticated internal development. The final phase of Marcus's education would focus on the most challenging but most crucial aspect of the Machiavellian mindset, the deliberate destruction of the weak self that invites manipulation and defeat. Part 3, The Forge of Internal Sovereignty. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. 6 months after his introduction to Victor's methodology, Marcus found himself in situations that would have previously triggered anxiety, desperation, or emotional reactivity, yet he remained calm and strategically focused. The external changes in his professional success and influence were visible to others, but the internal transformation was more profound and more permanent. He had begun the systematic process of identifying and eliminating the internal weaknesses that had made him vulnerable to external manipulation and control. Victor had explained that all external influence ultimately depends on internal vulnerabilities. The person who can be manipulated through fear has not mastered their relationship with uncertainty and risk. The person who can be controlled through social approval has not developed internal validation systems. The person who becomes desperate under pressure has not built adequate resilience and strategic redundancy. True invulnerability comes not from external defenses but from the elimination of internal weaknesses that others can exploit. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Victor had said during one of their early conversations. External threats can only succeed when they find corresponding weaknesses within. Eliminate the internal vulnerabilities, and external attempts at manipulation become powerless. This principle represented a departure from conventional approaches to personal development, which often focus on building strengths while accepting or managing weaknesses. The Machiavellian approach recognizes that unaddressed weaknesses become points of leverage that others can use against us, regardless of how many strengths we have developed in other areas. A single exploitable vulnerability can undermine years of strategic positioning and capability development. Marcus began his internal audit by examining the patterns of manipulation and control he had experienced throughout his life. In each case, others had gained leverage over him by triggering specific emotional responses: fear of rejection, need for approval, anxiety about financial security, guilt about disappointing others, shame about perceived inadequacies. These emotional triggers had created predictable behavioral patterns that others could exploit to influence his decisions. The first weakness Victor helped Marcus identify was his addiction to external validation. Despite his professional accomplishments, Marcus had remained dependent on approval from clients, colleagues, and even competitors for his sense of self-worth. This dependence created vulnerability because others could manipulate his behavior by withholding approval or threatening rejection. His decision-making had been distorted by the unconscious question, "What will others think of this choice?" The antidote to validation addiction requires developing what Victor called internal scorecard thinking. Instead of measuring success by external approval, the internally sovereign person develops criteria for excellence that are independent of others' opinions. These criteria focus on factors within personal control: the quality of preparation, the sophistication of analysis, the consistency of execution, the alignment between actions and principles. Marcus began practicing internal scorecard evaluation through daily reflection sessions where he assessed his performance using his own standards rather than imagined judgments from others. Had he prepared as thoroughly as his standards required? Had he communicated as clearly as he was capable of? Had he made decisions based on strategic analysis rather than emotional reactivity? Had he maintained his principles under pressure? This internal evaluation system gradually reduced his dependence on external feedback for emotional stability. He began to derive satisfaction from meeting his own standards, even when others did not recognize or appreciate his efforts. More importantly, he became less susceptible to manipulation through approval seeking because his sense of worth was no longer contingent on others' opinions. The second weakness Victor identified was Marcus's tendency toward scarcity thinking, which created desperation and poor decision-making when resources or opportunities seemed limited. Scarcity thinking had led Marcus to accept unfavorable terms out of fear that better opportunities would not emerge. It had caused him to overinvest in relationships with difficult clients because he feared losing revenue. It had prevented him from walking away from situations that were strategically problematic because he could not envision alternatives. Scarcity thinking is particularly dangerous because it becomes self-fulfilling. The person who operates from scarcity makes decisions that actually create scarcity by accepting poor opportunities, tolerating exploitation, and failing to develop strategic alternatives. Conversely, abundance thinking creates actual abundance by enabling strategic patience, selective engagement, and systematic opportunity development. Victor taught Marcus to combat scarcity thinking through what he called abundance conditioning, the systematic development of strategic redundancy in every important area of life. Instead of depending on single sources of income, relationship, or identity, Marcus began building multiple options that could provide security and satisfaction. This practical abundance made scarcity-based fears less compelling because they were less realistic. Abundance conditioning also involved retraining his perceptual patterns to notice opportunities and resources rather than focusing primarily on limitations and threats. Marcus began keeping an opportunity journal where he recorded potential collaborations, emerging market needs, developing trends, and relationship possibilities he encountered. This practice trained his mind to scan for abundance rather than scarcity, creating a psychological foundation for confident decision-making. The third weakness involved Marcus's relationship with uncertainty and control. His previous approach to planning had been based on the assumption that uncertainty could be eliminated through sufficient preparation and analysis. When uncertain situations arose, he had become anxious and reactive, trying to force clarity where clarity was not available. This relationship with uncertainty made him vulnerable to others who could manipulate him by creating or exploiting ambiguous situations. Victor introduced Marcus to the concept of uncertainty tolerance as a learnable skill rather than a fixed personality trait. Uncertainty tolerance involves maintaining cognitive clarity and emotional equilibrium in situations where outcomes cannot be predicted or controlled. This capability is crucial for strategic thinking because many of the most important decisions must be made with incomplete information under time pressure. Developing uncertainty tolerance required systematic exposure to ambiguous situations combined with specific mental frameworks for maintaining effectiveness under unclear conditions. Marcus began deliberately seeking projects and opportunities that involved significant uncertainty, using each experience as practice for maintaining strategic thinking when outcomes could not be guaranteed. The mental frameworks Victor provided focused on distinguishing between productive and unproductive responses to uncertainty. Productive responses involved gathering the best available information, analyzing potential scenarios, preparing for multiple contingencies, and maintaining flexibility to adapt as new information emerged. Unproductive responses involved anxiety about unknown factors, attempts to control uncontrollable variables, and paralysis while waiting for certainty that might never come. Through systematic practice with uncertain situations, Marcus developed what Victor called strategic confidence, the ability to make high-quality decisions and take effective action even when important variables remained unknown. This confidence was not based on false certainty but on trust in his ability to adapt and respond effectively to whatever circumstances emerged. The fourth weakness involved emotional reactivity under pressure. Marcus had a history of making poor decisions when stressed, tired, or facing aggressive opposition. His emotional responses to pressure had been predictable enough that others could manipulate him by creating stressful situations and, then, taking advantage of his impaired judgment during these periods. Emotional regulation under pressure requires understanding the relationship between physiological arousal, cognitive function, and decision quality. When stress hormones are elevated, the brain's executive functions are impaired, leading to simplified thinking, reduced creativity, and increased susceptibility to manipulation. The person who cannot maintain cognitive clarity under pressure becomes vulnerable to others who can create stressful situations and, then, exploit the resulting mental impairment. Victor taught Marcus specific techniques for maintaining cognitive function during high-pressure situations. These included breathing exercises that controlled physiological arousal, mental frameworks that structured thinking during stressful periods, and behavioral strategies that bought time for considered responses rather than reactive decisions. The breathing techniques focused on controlled diaphragmatic breathing that activated the parasympathetic nervous system and reduced stress hormone production. Marcus practiced these techniques during routine activities so they would be readily available during high-pressure situations. The goal was not to eliminate stress but to maintain cognitive function despite elevated arousal. The mental frameworks provided structured approaches to decision-making that functioned effectively even when emotional pressure was high. Instead of relying on intuitive responses that might be distorted by stress, Marcus learned to use systematic analysis processes that remained valid under pressure. These frameworks included stakeholder analysis, option evaluation, risk assessment, and contingency planning. The behavioral strategies focused on creating space for considered responses rather than immediate reactions. Marcus learned to recognize early signs of emotional activation and implement cooling-off procedures that prevented impulsive decisions. These included requesting time to consider important matters, removing himself from high-pressure situations when possible, and consulting with trusted advisors before making significant commitments. The fifth weakness involved what Victor called identity fragility, dependence on external circumstances for self-concept and emotional stability. Marcus had previously defined himself primarily through his roles and achievements: entrepreneur, consultant, industry expert. When these external identifiers were threatened or challenged, his entire sense of self became unstable, making him vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who could threaten his professional identity. Identity fragility creates vulnerability because it makes self-worth dependent on factors that others can influence or control. The person whose identity depends on a particular job can be manipulated by anyone who can affect their employment status. The person whose self-concept depends on social status can be controlled through threats to reputation or position. Victor taught Marcus to develop what he called identity sovereignty, a sense of self that was independent of external circumstances and could not be threatened by others. Identity sovereignty does not mean indifference to external outcomes but rather a core sense of value and capability that transcends any particular role, achievement, or situation. Building identity sovereignty required identifying the deeper qualities and capabilities that remained constant across different external circumstances. Marcus began to define himself in terms of character traits, thinking abilities, and values that could not be taken away by others: intellectual curiosity, strategic thinking capability, integrity, resilience, adaptability. These internal qualities formed a foundation of self-concept that remained stable regardless of external changes. The process also involved developing what Victor called role flexibility, the ability to engage fully with various external roles and identities while maintaining psychological distance from complete identification with any single role. Marcus learned to think of his professional roles as strategies for creating value rather than sources of identity. This perspective allowed him to adapt to changing circumstances without experiencing identity crisis. The sixth weakness involved conflict avoidance and people-pleasing tendencies that made Marcus vulnerable to manipulation by anyone willing to create interpersonal conflict. His desire to maintain harmony had led him to avoid necessary confrontations, accept unfavorable terms, and compromise his principles rather than risk disapproval or conflict. Conflict avoidance creates vulnerability because it signals to others that pressure and aggression will be effective influence strategies. The person who consistently yields to avoid conflict becomes an attractive target for those who are willing to use intimidation and pressure to achieve their objectives. Paradoxically, conflict avoidance often creates more conflict by encouraging others to use aggressive approaches. Victor taught Marcus that the ability to engage in conflict effectively is essential for maintaining autonomy and achieving important objectives. This did not mean becoming aggressive or confrontational, but rather developing the capability to maintain his position when faced with pressure from others. Effective conflict engagement involves clear communication of boundaries, willingness to accept relationship strain when necessary, and strategic thinking about when conflict is worth pursuing. Marcus began practicing conflict engagement in lower-stakes situations, gradually building his confidence and skill in standing firm when others attempted to pressure him. He learned to distinguish between productive conflict that addressed legitimate issues and manipulative conflict designed to wear him down. He developed frameworks for de-escalating unnecessary conflict while maintaining his position on important matters. The seventh weakness involved perfectionist tendencies that created paralysis and vulnerability to criticism. Marcus's fear of making mistakes had led him to over-research decisions, seek excessive input from others, and delay action while waiting for ideal conditions. This perfectionism made him vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who could trigger his fear of inadequacy or failure. Perfectionism creates vulnerability because it makes action dependent on impossible standards of certainty and control. The perfectionist becomes paralyzed by the possibility of criticism or failure, making them easy to manipulate by anyone who can threaten their self-image as competent and capable. Additionally, perfectionist paralysis prevents the rapid learning and adaptation that are necessary for success in complex, changing environments. Victor taught Marcus to replace perfectionist standards with what he called optimization thinking. Optimization involves making the best decisions possible with available information and resources, while accepting that no decision will ever be perfect. The goal is continuous improvement rather than impossible perfection. Optimization thinking also involves understanding that mistakes and failures are sources of information rather than evidence of inadequacy. Marcus learned to view setbacks as feedback about strategy effectiveness rather than judgments about personal worth. This shift reduced his fear of failure and increased his willingness to take strategic risks. The eighth and final weakness Victor identified was Marcus's tendency toward reactive rather than proactive thinking. He had spent most of his career responding to circumstances created by others rather than systematically creating circumstances that served his objectives. This reactive approach made him vulnerable to others who were more proactive in shaping situations to their advantage. Reactive thinking creates vulnerability because it cedes control of circumstances to others who are more strategic and proactive. The reactive person spends their time and energy responding to agendas set by others rather than pursuing their own strategic objectives. Over time, this pattern leads to decreasing influence and increasing dependence on others for opportunities and security. Victor taught Marcus to develop strategic initiative as an antidote to reactive thinking. Strategic initiative involves systematically analyzing his environment to identify opportunities for positive change, developing plans for creating desired circumstances rather than simply responding to current circumstances, and taking consistent action to shape his environment rather than merely adapting to it. Developing strategic initiative required shifting from problem-focused to opportunity-focused thinking. Instead of primarily identifying and solving problems created by others, Marcus began scanning for unmet needs, emerging trends, and structural changes that created opportunities for value creation. This shift in attention led to different types of projects and collaborations that positioned him as an initiator rather than a responder. Strategic initiative also involved developing longer time horizons for planning and decision-making. Instead of focusing primarily on immediate circumstances and short-term goals, Marcus began thinking systematically about where he wanted to be positioned in multiple years and working backward to identify the strategic moves necessary to reach those positions. The systematic elimination of these 8 vulnerabilities created what Victor called psychological invulnerability, not the absence of challenges or setbacks, but the absence of internal weaknesses that others could exploit for manipulation and control. This internal sovereignty became the foundation for sustainable external influence and strategic effectiveness. Marcus discovered that psychological invulnerability created a positive feedback loop with his external influence capabilities. The more internally sovereign he became, the more effectively he could implement external influence strategies because his motivation was strategic rather than emotional. Conversely, the more external influence he developed, the more evidence he had of his capabilities, which reinforced his internal sovereignty. The integration of outcome detachment, systemic influence, and internal sovereignty created what Victor called the Machiavellian synthesis, a complete approach to strategic living that maximized both effectiveness and autonomy. Marcus had learned to pursue his objectives without becoming attached to specific outcomes, to influence complex systems without becoming dependent on any particular relationship or opportunity, and to maintain internal strength regardless of external circumstances. This synthesis represented more than professional development or skill building. It was a fundamental transformation in how Marcus related to challenge, opportunity, uncertainty, and other people. He had become what Victor called strategically anti-fragile, someone who becomes stronger through exposure to difficulty rather than weakened by it. The man who had begun this journey as a reactive victim of circumstance had become an architect of his own destiny, capable of creating value for others while maintaining complete autonomy over his own choices and responses. He had learned to control the game by first controlling himself, to influence others by first becoming invulnerable to their influence over him, and to achieve his objectives by releasing attachment to any particular path toward those objectives. Marcus understood now that the greatest strength was not the ability to dominate others but the inability to be dominated by anyone or anything external to himself. He had destroyed his weak self not through suppression or denial but through systematic replacement of vulnerability with capability, reactivity with strategic thinking, and dependence with sovereignty. In doing so, he had become truly invulnerable not because nothing could challenge him, but because he had developed the internal resources to meet any challenge effectively. The journey toward internal sovereignty and strategic effectiveness is never complete, but the foundation had been built. Marcus had learned to release outcomes while maintaining absolute faith in method, to control complex systems through understanding and positioning rather than force, and to eliminate internal weaknesses that others could exploit. He had become, in Victor's words, a man who can never be destroyed by others because he has already destroyed everything within himself that was destroyable. This transformation represented not just personal development but a fundamental shift in how power and influence operate in the modern world. The future belongs not to those who can dominate others through force or manipulation, but to those who have achieved such internal mastery that they cannot be controlled by external forces, while simultaneously developing the sophisticated understanding of systems necessary to create value and influence outcomes through strategic thinking and ethical action. The Machiavellian mindset, properly understood, is not about manipulation or exploitation but about effectiveness and autonomy. It is about becoming strong enough internally to engage with the world from a position of sovereignty rather than dependence, skilled enough strategically to create value for others while pursuing one's own objectives, and wise enough to understand that true power comes from the integration of internal mastery with external influence. Marcus had learned these lessons through systematic practice and consistent application over many months. The principles that had seemed abstract when Victor first introduced them had become practical tools for navigating complex challenges and creating opportunities. The mindset that had initially felt foreign had become natural and intuitive. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he becomes invulnerable to external challenges, but because he develops the internal resources to transform any challenge into an opportunity for growth and strategic advancement.